Well, why not? I'll try one of my signature talks. I just did one, first time ever. But I had some notes to look down at. And I'm doing my car conversations here as per usual. Coming back from Onchioto. And difficulty is I realized, oh, well, let's try one of these. It's going to hurt. I was very happy with the way that one went. But only this, that it took an hour and 3 minutes. So maybe to do a 30-minute one, I just cut and paste out half of the items, or cut and paste out a third of them, and then just cover the highlights. So when I realized I didn't have any notes, because I did follow a bit of an outline that was on my phone, and I don't have that, but I decided, well, let's try it anyway. So I'm going to try to duplicate what I just did a little while ago that took about an hour, but I won't have my cheat notes to look down and see, okay, what did I miss? Basically divided up in my own system anyway into these 4 categories: the flyover, and then gifts, trying to really emphasize the gifts in this. So tangible gifts and physical contributions, and then the truth, the white man was Indian, put the white man on the map, and feeling proud, and they take a lot of credit for things that don't belong to them. So that's kind of number 3. And then number 4 is gifts of thoughts and ideas, in which I cover a lot of the Iroquois Confederacy points. So I'm already expecting it to be a little, I tend to jump around and be conversational as it is, but in this case I don't really have anything to look at, so we'll see how it goes. I'm at about 2 minutes right now, so we'll see how it works. Hello everyone, my name's Dave Patterson. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to help you discover what we want to do, have some fun here. I'll help you discover more about what was happening in the year 1492 in the Western Hemisphere. And that's basically why I'm here. So I want to ask you something first, though. And I'll get a show of hands on this. So how many people in this audience, and put your hand up now if this is you, how many people in this audience have taken part in a genocide at some point? Anybody? And I'm not talking about having one perpetrated upon you now. I'm talking about administering a genocide. Anybody at all in the audience taking part in a genocide? Nobody? No hands at all going up. So nobody in this audience has taken part in a genocide. Well, I have. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. And no, I'm not going to be tough on you like that. It's not going to go like that. I'm just trying to get your attention a little bit, and that's a very, very charged word. It's always risky to use, for sure. But as we talk about the disease, we're not as culpable as we certainly could be if it was just strictly based on our white man's conquering abilities. Anyway, let's start with a little flyover of some parts of the world. We'll fly over Europe and just quickly over Africa, and then we'll cover Central America, South America, Central America, North America, a little bit of a flyover. I want to concentrate on the gifts that were brought and given to the world by Indians. Indians being everyone who existed in the Western Hemisphere in 1492 when the Europeans came. No, that's not part of it. Although I will talk about health and fitness. So we're flying down over Europe. We see the land of kings and queens, of course. Countries have been at war quite a bit. They weren't really doing that well in Europe from the point of view of they were being hit with quite a few diseases. And these would come in waves and attacked the people. They had livestock in Europe. Most of the diseases that we deal with related back to having animals basically living with you, is what it amounted to. But they had their difficulties. They had the bubonic plague. There was at times malaria. Now that's different around the world. Malaria has had its own issues all over the place. But certainly measles, mumps, tetanus, typhoid, yellow fever, and then smallpox, the biggest of all. So any of these could hit in waves at any time. They had difficulties with nutrition and just general health and well-being in Europe. Most of the people were serfs who were a little better than slaves at that time. They had livestock. They had sources of protein. They also had, their agriculture was doing very nicely, but they had difficulty keeping it all in order for long periods of time such that the society could flourish in a way that they would have some kind of nutrition, a nutritional balance, something like what we would look at today and say that was a reasonable nutrition. As you look down, you'll see, of course, divided into the many, many countries and the borders in which there had been thousands of changes over the years in all the borders in Europe, just as there's been many, many dozens since that period of time, since around 1500. With this idea of the borders and the fact that they kept livestock, they were part of a landmass that included Africa and Asia and Europe. So with that particular territory that they had came a certain amount of livestock, and a good portion of the domesticatable animals existing in the world, there's only 42 of them. A good portion of them were accessible through Africa, Asia, and Europe. So as you look down on Europe, as you're flying over, livestock is certainly a fair part of all the farming that's going on, mostly being carried out by serfs, and they tended to be fenced in. So they've got these little square and rectangular plots, and I know you've seen that many times. We still do the same thing here in our North America. This is a very westernized, Europeanized, Eurocentric type of approach to doing it. Unlike the Americas, where they did not have that, they grew all their food in together. So you'll see the livestock, you'll see fences put up, you'll see squares, a very territorial sort of feel to everything, including the crops being in rows, very organized in rows, and they felt that this was the way the agriculture had to be done. Of course, there was just one way to do it. But like many things, in the peculiar ways of the Europeans, it's difficult for them to look and see a completely other way of doing something and treating it as a valid methodology. So to the south of Europe, going down to the south of Europe, same situation. It's all kings and queens. Underneath them you had the nobles and dukes and barons and earls, which were like little kings and queens themselves, and they ran their little kingdoms. And a situation of probably everybody wanting to be the king and queen, really, and wanting to dominate everybody if they could, if they ever got a chance to. In the very south now we get to Spain. In the year 1492 is when they sent Columbus, and Ferdinand and Isabella finally gave the go-ahead for him. They got the Pope's blessing less than 2 years after. That yes, it's fair to go in and completely dominate and kill off, if necessary, all these indigenous populations. As long as you're there to convert them, then that was okay. Prior to him giving that, they had difficulties with what was going on, because Columbus did massacre and kill a lot of people, millions of people, in fact. Spain had been at war for 800 years, and that war just ended that very year, 1492, and they made a few other changes related to the Inquisitions and related to Jewish history that we don't have time to go into here. But that war had just ended. All of Europe, they were very, very warlike people. The weaponry they had was certainly, they had steel, they had good weaponry. Health-wise, again, let's go back to they were a small people, about 5 feet was the average height, so a grade 8 child would have difficulty getting into a conquistador's suit of armor today. About 1 out of every 10 people in Europe, due to improper nutrition and in general poor conditions of health, was infirm in some way. And I'm not referring to smallpox. Most of them did get smallpox, and if they lived through it, then they had marks on them from the smallpox, but they were immune then for the rest of their lives. But I'm talking about actually disabled, handicapped, so hunchback or lame people, blind, deaf, or just plain insane. 1 out of every 10 people. Cleanliness was something that was not on their agenda at all. They had no idea that this could tie in with health and well-being and have an impact on disease. Most Europeans did not bathe, so they may bathe a few times in their lifetime. The average was maybe 2 times in their whole life, and some didn't bathe at all. The second law ever passed in the New World by Queen Isabella, was to forbid and outlaw bathing among the Indians because it was very bad for their health. So we'll fly a little further south, just quickly over Africa, to realize that the slave trade was becoming a major money-making venture operation all around the world, which at that time, between then and the next 100 years, there was the globalization that took place, the Columbian Exchange, as they refer to it, has a huge impact on our history, and even a big impact on the globalization that we're going through today, as that term has been coined for today. But globalization between 1500 and 1560 is an entire story of its own. And I do have 30 or 40 seminars, and some of them relate to some of the things that went on shortly after the period of 1492. But enough to say for now, as we fly over Africa, that there were ships pulling up to Africa and heading around the world, already starting to head around the world in different parts of the world, and having a slave trade completely run by Africans. It wasn't a bunch of Europeans or Asians coming in and kidnapping blacks. It was completely run by Africans themselves, and normally it was tribes that were at war with one another and different stories going on. But suffice to say that the stage was being set for a worldwide network of the transfer of different things. Philippines, Shanghai, the Americas, Mexico, the West Indies, the East Coast of the United States, Venice, Genoa, Lisbon, Madrid, Paris, London. These were all, and Africa, of course, too. These were all these trade routes that had been already started to set in place by around the year 1500. So let's go across the Atlantic now to South America. We start to see a bit of an idea of the population of the Western Hemisphere. 100 million people. Now, Europe at that time had 70 million people. So in some of the disease situations that I will get into briefly, smallpox, which can travel very, very quickly, in 150 years, because of these populations, 100 million people in the Americas, smallpox in that 150 years after 1492 wiped out 1 out of every 5 people on the planet was an American Indian that was wiped out. By American Indian, I mean any Indian whose in the Western Hemisphere at that time. So let's fly over the civilization around the Andes. We see they were a very well populated and advanced civilization. Excellent farmers. Contributed that one nation of Indians that had been developing food for thousands of years, gave more to the world in terms of food plants than all of Europe put together. So the gifts that they gave of food gave more than the Czechs, the Germans, the Swiss, the Irish, the British, the French, the Poles, the Spanish, all put together. That one Indian nation gave more. Now, if that isn't a great gift contribution to the world, I don't know what is. They grow 4,900 types of potatoes in that area. What do we call that potato today? Anybody got any idea? What's the most common term that you tend to think of in history for the potato? What they called it? The Irish potato. That's one of many, many products that has European and foreign names attached to it. The Irish potato. Egyptian cotton. Egyptians had a very crude fiber cotton, not grown anywhere in the world today commercially. The Europeans first saw the South American cotton. They thought it was silk. It was that fine. They had the finest, and South Sea cotton is the finest cotton in the world, and that is what's grown today. Turkish tobacco, Jerusalem artichoke, Irish potato, Italian beans. All the beans that we have today in the world, except for two, from China, horse bean and soybean, came from that one Indian nation as well too. And beans, of course, have protein. Very, very important for nutrition and for a balanced diet. And the Indians were, on a whole, in the Western civilization, were fairly healthy, had good nutrition. They didn't know what nutrition was any more than the Europeans knew what nutrition was. But they had balanced diets. And they developed these foods over the years, not growing out in the wild by any means, but developed on Indian farms by Indians. 49 different types of potatoes. 4,900 different types of potatoes that nation had, and they still grow today. And that gift to the world saved the world different times in famine. And corn, southern Europe, corn, and northern Europe, the potato is well known during the famine as saving the world. That is a great gift to the world, not taught to our little Caucasian children for some reason in the history books. Now, that civilization that we're looking at, they were very high up in the mountains in the Andes, and no one else in the world has ever attempted to create an empire, create a civilization that high up, and they managed to do it. Now, the Incas were not an enviable empire by any means, nothing that we want to aspire to, but they certainly did have a lot of very intriguing things that they had put in place. And their method of food planting, especially in the elevated climates that they had, their contributions of sweet potatoes and corn. Potatoes came from the Andes. Sweet potatoes, I don't know where that came from. I got to look that up. Fortunately, this isn't being put on YouTube, so I can afford to have these little asides. If this ends up on my private channel someday, I'm sorry, because it's really weird when I'm doing it at night, completely at night. If I turn this light off, it's like this. Watch. Oh, there's nobody behind me right now, so you're getting black. But if somebody pulls up behind me, you get this strange, a little sickly white glow in the middle. I can show that to you if it comes up. I'll show it to myself. Probably I'll be the only one watching this thing. So anyway, sorry for that aside. Corn was from Central America. And sweet potatoes, I'm not sure, but corn and sweet potatoes were far easier to grow than any other crops. Certainly wheat, the yield from wheat was nothing like corn. Europeans were amazed when they saw the yield from an acreage of corn. They were astounded, and they wanted to take corn back to Europe immediately, and they did. corn and sweet potatoes can grow in almost all conditions. And that's what made them such a welcome plant around the world. Corn and sweet potatoes were transplanted to China and were responsible, because they went into the countryside in China where they had a lot of difficulty, and rice is difficult to grow. A doubling of the population in China took place between 1700 and 1850, fact check, mostly related to the fact that they had corn and sweet potato that the average person could grow. They could grow it on scruffy land, whereas a lot of agricultural products are very finicky about where they will grow, and they can be very tricky to work with. Not the case with sweet potatoes and corn. So now that civilization, we also see they were connected by a roadway called the Inca Road in their language. I'll give you a look at this video now when it's looking this way. There we are. So I'm not sure why there's something going across my face now, but before it was fine. Anyway, that's a look. Oh, here is it. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, if someone gets behind me, it has this kind of look to it. So it is. So there I am, like a talking head. Talking about your talking heads, eh? Like, here's the news, and now for the news. Anyway, let's go back to, let's get serious about this. Come on. This is your signature talk here. Get serious. All right, I'm serious. Now, that civilization, they had a roadway in place. And certainly we talk about the Appian Way, which was it's a very old road and nicely made, but about 300 miles long south of Rome. But they had a road, and everybody knows about that. Kids probably know about it. I mean, they teach it in school. So many of these things are just not taught. They're just, the conqueror writes the history books, and that's the end of that. I'm sorry. But 500 years is a long time to live in ignorance, and it's time for some changes on this. Anyway, this road is a very interesting, fascinating story that would certainly be better than a lot of the garbage that we've been teaching people about Indians for all these hundreds of years. A remarkable accomplishment, this road. It covers an area about 12,000 kilometers. It's about 8,000 or 9,000 miles long. Distance covering the equivalent of Newfoundland to Vancouver, this road. And this is also up in the mountains. So it was made out of stone. Its average width was 9 to 13 feet, so about a 1 lane to a lane and a half of road, made out of stone, covering the mountains. They 600 or 700 or 800 years old, completely in place by the year 1492, and still used today, 500 years after that, with engineers going there and trying to figure out what were they doing with their water runoffs, with their irrigation, with their control of the moisture. The local cultures tended to look after these areas, build them, and look after them and maintain them. Because that civilization was very much based on the textiles. And the conquistadors quickly threw away their metal and steel breastplates because they realized that the ones used by the Andean warriors were highly superior and much lighter and more comfortable. They were completely made out of natural fiber material, as were parts of this roadway, because they had to cut through mountains. They had to go across ravines. They had to go across some long areas as well, too. They had causeways. They had gondolas when it was too far, and they had suspension bridges, unknown in Europe at that time, and a gift by the American Indian to engineers in Europe, a suspension bridge with cables a foot in diameter, and all their suspension bridges, of which they had dozens and dozens of these on the roadway. There was always 2 of them, completely tended by all the local people. They were able to travel on their roadway and stay at these little houses that were set up every so often so that when you were traveling you'd have a place to stay. Now they had runners along the roadway. These runners were set up every 9 miles, and could run 250 kilometers a day along the road. What were they running with? Well, they were running with messages, news, spreading throughout the empire. And what they carried was these little knotted strings, which have recently been discovered to be writing. Now, we know that anybody without an alphabet obviously is a savage running around out in the woods in a diaper, not really capable of creating too much in the way of civilization. So, in the same way as we've got wampum in the north, where two people who cannot communicate with each other intelligibly at all because of their language differ, can look at something that's written and get the message out of it. A lot of different cultures. That's the way Chinese is. They cannot communicate with each other, all these different dialects and languages, but the Chinese script is universal and they can communicate through that. Well, a system of knots in these cords and strings that they had in the Andes that the Incas used was thought to just strictly be art until just recently, and they're scattered all over the world in museums, and they're trying to bring them back now and figure out what the language was. That's what these runners were using. This is how the orders were sent around the empire, and it was one of the more complicated, complex empires in the world. Not an empire to be envied or to aspire to by any means. Not a very nice empire, but they certainly had a lot of interesting qualities about them, and that was one of them. Their means of communicating, giving news and sending orders throughout the empire, so that in a period of 8 days they could travel 2,000 kilometers. This was also to their undoing in terms of disease spreading around the planet when that time came for that. And since this talk's around 1492, guess what? That time's coming soon. So we fly over the Andes, and we're seeing that there's no domesticatable animals in this part of the world, in the Western Hemisphere, except for the turkey, the dog, the llama, and alpaca, which will not support a human being. They can use it as a pack animal, and they certainly did. But in the last wipeout of a lot of these creatures that they're trying to figure out why, but when the mastodon and the mammoth disappeared, there was two types of species of horses, and 3 different types of camels in the Western Hemisphere, but they disappeared during that same period of time. So they never had that option. Maybe they were spared a lot of suffering and disease because of it, but they certainly didn't have the option of the quick ways of travel. They did a lot of what they did on foot, using hand method, with bronze being the hardest metal that they were capable of using. So as we fly a little bit south now, we come into the Central America, where the Mexica, which also we're talking about Aztecs and Olmecs and different civilizations that had come and went there. But this is where corn was introduced into the world, probably the most valuable staple agricultural item known in the world today, that it's getting into all of our food and even used for fuel now. Over 300 different types of corn those people had. Now the area, Teotihuacan, was the largest city in the Western Hemisphere, larger than the biggest city in Europe. The biggest city in Europe was Paris. Teotihuacan was larger than Paris at that time, in the same way as I'd mentioned. The population of 100 million in the Western Hemisphere was larger than the population of Europe, which was 70 million at that time. Now, in the smallpox epidemics that occurred between 1500 and 1640, 1 out of every 5 people on Earth was an Indian killed by smallpox. And that's not just in that area. 20% of the entire population of the planet was American Indians wiped out by smallpox in that 140-year period. The largest epidemic death rate in history, is what occurred there. Now the Mexicans they had a very dense population, denser than anywhere on Earth. The density level in that Mexican basin was 2 times anywhere else on Earth at that time. So they had a fairly well-developed city, and including their the running water that came into the city and their sanitation systems as well too. They had 4, 5, and 6-story buildings, which is partly why the density was so high. They also gave a lot of many food plants to the world. And as we fly further south, we get into the North American continent, and that is where we were again surprised by some of the density, because as we picture this pristine wilderness and certainly all these empty woods just waiting for somebody like us to sort of move into them, and hey, the Europeans are here, and good, finally we've got somebody to live here. Up and down, if you go up and down the eastern seaboard at that time, it was pretty much total people is what you'd see if you were going along there in a ship. It wasn't like a place where you could just land and say, well, now we're going to take this. It was completely populated. Similar to the way these areas go. Sometimes there was towns, sometimes villages, sometimes small settlements, sometimes farms spread out on their own, or families or clans spread out on their own. So you've got a cornucopia, a mix of different types of setups in terms of how the villages went. But the farms, because of the way the farms went out from the towns and take up a lot of space, basically as you go along the coast, you're seeing populated areas pretty well all the way down. And that's the way that went. Now, I want to get into some truth that some of the stories in history are not very proud stories for the white people, and we haven't been willing to tell them and put them in our history books. The Tuscarora Indian in North America is a great example of a story that what happened to them at the hands of white men happened to all Indians at one point. We're talking about a lot of Indians. North America alone had 1,200 different languages being spoken, a lot of culture groups. And we taught them mostly through our black robes and missionaries to be ashamed. When you teach someone to be ashamed of their own grandfather, you have done them the worst service possible in the worst possible way, because they have no culture. At that point, they have nothing. They are lost. They are lost forever. When you do that repeatedly, generation after generation and generation, you've got a people that's a very distorted image of what they once were. Now, our image of the Indian is a completely distorted, and I submit that image has gone all the way around the world as well too. I mean, Hollywood could bear some of the brunt of that, but a lot of academics who have written a lot of history books have not helped matters very much. And the conqueror writes the history books, okay, fine, we know all that, but it may take a generation or two to undo some of this mess, but the 500 years of fog is lifting. It's time to get started on some of this. Anyway, there was a peoples called the Iroquois, and they had the Iroquois Confederacy, which most of us tend to think of it as the 5 nations and later the six nations. And you'll see that in all the history books. The years 1550 or the year 1600 began, and then the Tuscaroras came in 1720. I've seen it in Wikipedia. 1600 was mentioned, which makes us feel a lot better as Europeans to know that while there wasn't many people here, the populations that were estimated were about a 20th of what really probably existed here. We tend to think of it as pristine wilderness just waiting for us to move in. Yeah, they're waiting for us to move in. We moved exactly into 25 or 30 of their villages along the eastern seaboard that had been depopulated by smallpox, and then they moved into that. Pristine wilderness, not there by any means. The Iroquois Confederacy was not created after the Europeans came to North American continent. That's a convenience that we have created, that idea that it came afterwards. They started in 1142. Okay, 850 years ago. That's how long it's been around. And it was a great experiment that continues to this day. The world's first true democracy. And I'll explain to you why I say that. That Iroquois Confederacy has contributed a lot to today's civilization. The gifts of thought and the gift of ideas are just as important as the gift of shoes and good boots that they gave the Europeans. The Europeans quickly threw their boots away, which they couldn't even walk in, and they were borrowing the Indians' footwear so often, and the Indians' houses, which did not leak and were not drafty, like all the houses in England at that time, which were mud and dauber houses. And these are all very well documented things in the written reports that Europeans made. The peacemaker, who is a famous person in the Iroquois Confederacy, in 1142, where they've tracked that year, made the first United Nations in the world. Contrary to that myth about the warlike Iroquois, the Iroquois Confederacy was created to do away with war. It was created for peace. And it was the world's first true democracy. Everyone had a voice in that society. It was a matrilineal society, in that the women controlled the property, and they also controlled the election of the leaders being the men. The women of today would be envious of the women's rights in the Iroquois Confederacy at that time. Women just started voting. The last European country only gave women the vote in the 1980s. They had the first true democracy. Now you'll say, well, everything good and great had to come from the white man's land in Europe, the land of kings and queens. Land of kings and queens is not a great place to go looking for the world's first democracy, but that's what they'll do. They'll look vainly all over the map with a magnifying glass, and desperately they'll look until they finally come up. They'll check the Magna Carta, which doesn't say anything about the people, and was created somewhat, gave the nobles a little voice, because what happened in France just across the channel, well, they all lost their heads. They knew they had to do something on the Magna Carta. And where did the French get their ideas? They got them from America. And where did America get them from? The Iroquois. And the historians have begun admitting this 60, 70, 80 years ago, that the U.S. Constitution came directly from the Iroquois Confederacy's Constitution. And they practically copied it, and it's well documented by all of the founding fathers how that occurred. Now, they had a system of government with two houses. What does that sound like? Your American government. The European, we left our poor European there with the magnifying glass. Okay, they'll come up with this. The Greeks had a democracy. Okay. So the Greeks had a little parliament and they voted in that, but even kings and queens got together with committees and voted on things. The Greeks were 75% slaves. That's not a true democracy. Even like America was not a true democracy when it started. The Greeks were 75% slaves. The women were owned. The women were property at that time. They didn't have a voice. Children didn't have a voice. Prisoners didn't have a voice. Women had a voice in the Iroquois Confederacy. All prisoners were immediately adopted into the. They were not all burned at the stake and killed off like you read about in all those fabricated history books. They became citizens of the Iroquois nation immediately with all the rights that go with it. And they had a voice. Children had a voice in the Iroquois Confederacy at the age of reason, 14, 15, 16. That's still ahead of its time. Children's rights is not even on anybody's radar today. Why are 16-year-olds driving around when 14, 15, 16-year-olds who can think and are at the age of reason or don't have a voice in our society? And you've got 95 and 96-year-olds who cannot hold a pencil and need somebody in there with them, are checking off their box, and we can't give a voice to people who choose and want one at the age of 14, 15, 16. In the Iroquois Confederacy, everybody had a voice. So not only that, with the Greeks, they had an institutionalized system whereby the adult males had sexual relationships with young boys. And that was an institutionalized, it was an official institutionalized part of their society. They were different than the image that we have on TV of the toga, cradle of civilization. The cradle of civilization, as they call it. Cradle of civilization is convenient, just like all the history is convenient. They want to pick the good stuff. The white man wants to say, what has this got to do with me? I'm sorry, there was disease. What could we? It was 500 years ago. What has it got to do with me? And I appreciate that. But do they say, what has it got to do with me when it comes to taking credit for our civilization? They take an awful lot of credit that doesn't belong to them. The Irish potato, Jerusalem artichoke, Italian bean, Egyptian cotton, Turkish tobacco, India rubber. Those are exemplified ways of saying that they take credit for everything. We thought all this up over there. That's the way white men in North America and Europe tend to think of these civilization aspects of things. The Indian of the Western Hemisphere has a lot to be proud of. They gave a lot of gifts. They not only gave a lot of gifts, they gave up everything that we took from them. And to not even get credit for that or for anything, that's an injustice. Our society is based on some of these injustices. People are just beginning to find out about some of the fascinating stories. So the Greeks being 75% slaves. What about the Iroquois? Slavery was outlawed. It was unknown to them. When the white man came, the slave trade was huge. It was one of the biggest money-making ventures in the world. And Indians were brought into it in a big way. Believe me. In fact, 2 million to 4 million Indians were taken by the Quakers and the Eastern Seaboard Europeans, and all of these pious individuals were sold into slavery in the West Indies, because they would much sooner buy a black person, sell an Indian into slavery, and buy a black person to be their slave, than to have an Indian as a slave and maybe their town is down the road here a little ways. That's the way they operated. So slavery was outlawed in the Iroquois Confederacy. And when the U.S. Civil War came, the Mason-Dixon line can be easily tracked back to the influence of the Iroquois and the Iroquois Confederacy, because they would not track down runaway slaves. A huge part of that industry was runaway slaves, and whole towns and cities that exist all the way up and down the Western Hemisphere, and still exist today, by the way, in South America, Central America, and North America. Slave cities, historically, that have been there for 350, 400 years. Runaway slaves was a big deal, and Indians were used to track them down, and the Iroquois would not participate. Slavery had always been outlawed. So not only was slavery not known to them, rape was not known to them, nor was women abuse or child abuse. In all of the stories, and there's been 800 to 1,000 stories, every one of them has been debunked, that there is no valid story on record of any Native Indian, for that matter, but let's just say Iroquois Confederacy, prisoner being mistreated, any woman or child being mistreated in any way. Sexual abuse was unknown in the Iroquois Confederacy. They had a lot to offer. They had a lot to offer in the way of being the first true democracy in the world. And look how far ahead they were. The Americans were well into the 1800s before they even got rid of slavery. the Iroquois Confederacy was already 350 years old when they left Europe to try to, quote, discover America. So that's a little bit about the Iroquois Confederacy. The women's rights movement in the world is directly trackable back to the Iroquois Confederacy. Susan Anthony and the other names of those suffragettes that I wrote down 9 of them, and I'm going to memorize the main 3. Susan Anthony and her 2 friends, that they went around the world to different conferences in Europe at that time. It was well documented that they were friends with European women. They visited they were friends with Iroquois women and visited Iroquois villages and towns and got to know completely how that system worked. And it's very well known that the suffragette movement had its basis in the Iroquois Confederacy. So they gave us the gift of democracy. They gave us the gift of having a voice at the age of reason, which we have not yet manifested. They gave us the gift of women's rights around the world. They gave us many gifts of food as well too, and clothing, and the boats, and the clothing that they wore. The boats, they used to joke with the Europeans and laugh and paddle circles around them, literally circles around them. The Europeans, yes, they went on the oceans, and the American indigenous people were actually very good seamen, because all the roads, remember, were rivers and lakes at that time. They very quickly learned how to build those ocean-going ships, and they had to quite often go down and rescue some of their kinsmen from the West Indies. That's one of the reasons they got good at it. So the Iroquois contributed women's rights, democracy, and many other things as gifts to the world from the American Indian. But one of the largest of all is the idea of freedom and liberty that's so put up on a pedestal by America and taken to be theirs. And they have every right to do that, and they should be proud of that, as we in Canada should as well. That we are proud and we are free people. But that was a gift that also came from the Iroquois. And I will tell you that in Europe, they were afraid of this, and of course it led to the America breaking away from Britain, because they had a war over representation at that time. Thomas Jefferson spoke very eloquently and freely about the influence that the Iroquois had on the founding fathers. But this feeling of liberty and freedom that the Indian was difficult to deal with, they were unable to be dominated. This was known from the very beginning, and eventually as it got up into the 1600s, the European kings and queens and the authorities and powers that be sent spies over to look at this dangerous system that they had of actually voting their own people, who could also be then voted out of office. And by the way, it was the women who voted the leaders out of office, the chiefs. They picked the chiefs, they picked who could be a chief, and they were able to oust those chiefs as well too. And there was some carrying down of the system, but it was through the woman's lineage, to the nephew, not through the man's side. So there was a protective aspect in that. Anyway, they did send spies over who sent reports back to Europe saying this is a very dangerous trend. The Indian was known to Rousseau, many of the Voltaire, Engels, many of the philosophers, and actually the early communist writers as well too. They were very well known that there was this spirit. It's the wooden Indian, so it's not the Indian that you and I have in our mind of free and liberty and living in a society that's very much like ours. It was that kind of almost like a wild animal type of freedom, like a bear. They didn't see the Indian as very much of an equal type of a human being, which is why they felt it was okay to burn them at the stake and skin them alive in their towns and make little tobacco pouches out of baby skins. Some of these things that are well documented to have taken place. on Indians at the hands of white men. There's records of Indians going over to places in Europe. London is the one I'm thinking of. No, it wouldn't be London, though, could it? 16 that early? As early as 1530, Indians going to European cities, taken there by traders, which is what a history book would say, be a slave trader, but they wouldn't say that. It's not a proud story. Traders, it's a white lie that they tell in history books. And the Indians didn't get it. In their society, it would be considered a shame for someone to go hungry. Even your worst enemy wouldn't go hungry unless everybody went hungry. It wasn't they weren't designed to even think that way. And they, by the way, had a system of writing too, the way the knots did, the way they had these knots. Their wampum could actually be read. It wasn't money. That was the distortion that the English, French, and Dutch tried to superimpose on the Indian civilization later to destroy their administrative capabilities and try to help to keep them from causing trouble to the Dutch, English, and French. Wampum was a system similar to the Chinese script that could be read by people who spoke completely different languages, but they could read a specialist within the tribe could read the wampum, and they could, to the point of being able to actually pick out passages the way we do with our writing. Now, that's fairly unknown. Anyway, in these reports of an Indian being in a European city so early on, and not being able to grasp what was going on, that there's these big mansions and one person eating, gorging themselves and having all the food they can, and then going out for a walk and seeing in the gutter these people with not dressed and starving, and some already dead. And first of all, they couldn't figure it out because the class system was so entrenched. Most places in the world at that time, almost everywhere in the world, and certainly in Europe, the class system ran everything. And they didn't understand that they're being quoted as saying, they didn't see why wouldn't they burn down that building or strangle that person when they need to eat. But the class system was so strong, it just wasn't only because force would be used upon you. That was just the way it was. It was so built into everything that they did. So this feeling of liberty and freedom that a lot of the European philosophers, Voltaire and Rousseau, they did write about it. They were fascinated by it. And that really is where that feeling came from around the world. The Americans get credit for it, which is fine, but when the Berlin Wall fell, for instance, it was Americanisms that were trotted out at that time for the feeling of freedom. Americanisms that had their root in the Iroquois Confederacy. When the Arab Spring happened, they sang, "We shall overcome." It has an American feel to it when people are wanting to have a sense of liberty and freedom around the world. It has an American feel to it. And the Americans got that directly from the Iroquois Confederacy. So, anyway, that's just a little bit about some of the what was going on at that time in the Western Hemisphere. And I hope that some of this information can start to filter down into our little Caucasian boys and girls who grow up conditioned to think that everything good and great had to be thought up over there, and this is the white man's civilization. Certainly like to change that, and they'd be a lot more interested and fascinated by the real history. At least I am. Anyway, thanks a lot for your time.